They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Gerald Mercer said the moment Hannah Clarke walked through the glass doors of the Cedar Creek Medical Supply retail location, her resume trembling slightly in her hands. He didn't know she'd spent 5 years as a combat surgeon in Tikrit. He didn't know her hands had held together 73 lives in a single deployment. He didn't know the folded flag in her purse belonged to Captain Maria Reyes, the medic who'd taken her assignment and died 4 days into the rotation. What happened next didn't just change Hannah's life. It changed everything. Hannah Clarke stood at the customer service counter inside Lenox Square Mall, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects, mixing with pop music and the smell of cinnamon pretzels drifting from the food court 2 corridors away. The mall moved around her in its rhythmic chaos, couples browsing, teenagers laughing, the mechanical chime of the escalators. But at this counter, in this moment, the world had narrowed to a single point of judgment. Dr. Gerald Mercer held her resume between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. His office was visible through a glass partition behind the register, all mahogany furniture and motivational posters about team excellence. He was the kind of man who'd never worn scrubs, never stood in a field hospital with no anesthesia, never held someone's hand while they died. Mercer was 47, with the soft build of someone who ordered lunch delivered and wore $200 watches to retail management interviews. His smile didn't reach his eyes. 5 years of unverified overseas employment, he said, loud enough for the other 3 job applicants sitting in folding chairs against the wall to hear every word. His voice was a blade wrapped in politeness. You expect me to believe you were performing specialized work? Hannah's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Not enough for him to see it as weakness. She'd learned in Tikrit that composure was armor. She'd learned it in the field hospital outside the city when mortars fell and the lights went out, and she'd operated by flashlight and adrenaline and muscle memory that transcended fear. The work was classified, Hannah said. Her voice was steady, measured. Those records aren't available for civilian verification. Mercer's eyes narrowed. He tapped the 5-year gap with his pen, each tap deliberate, rhythmic. Ms. Clarke, we've been having significant issues with inventory shrinkage. I can't risk hiring someone who might be covering up theft charges. Or worse. The other applicants looked away. They recognized what this was. A culling. A display of power for its own sake. Hannah met his eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't look down. She didn't feel the urge to explain herself because she'd stopped explaining herself the day her service record was classified and her deployment erased and the Pentagon had cut her loose with a civilian identity and an order to disappear. That was a different kind of humiliation, the kind that happened in secure rooms with flags on the walls and generals who spoke without raising their voices. This was nothing. I understand you have concerns, Mr. Mercer, she said. Her right hand unconsciously moved to the interior pocket of her blazer, where the folded flag sat against her ribs. A moment of weakness. She caught it. She stopped the motion, let her hand fall back to her side. But questioning my integrity without evidence says more about your judgment than my character. The room shifted. One of the applicants looked up, surprised. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or perhaps Hannah was simply noticing them now, the way you notice a sound after it's been pointed out. The smell of cinnamon grew stronger. Someone from the pretzel stand had walked past, close enough to the customer service counter that the sweetness invaded the space. Mercer's expression changed. His jaw tightened in the exact same way Hannah's had, but where hers was restraint, his was rage. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not by applicants. Not by people he decided were beneath him before they'd opened their mouths. That's exactly the attitude problem I'm talking about, he said. His voice dropped, which made it worse. Controlled anger was more dangerous than shouted anger. Hannah knew this. She'd heard it before, in debrief rooms, in performance reviews delivered by men who had all the institutional power and knew exactly how to use it. Maybe you need a walk. He turned toward the mall entrance, where a security guard named Carlos stood near the potted plants and the store directory. Carlos was young, maybe 24, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd never been tested. He'd respond to Mercer's authority because that's what the job required. There would be no judgment, no hesitation. "Carlos," Mercer called out, and his voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Could you escort Ms. Clarke from the premises? She's become disruptive." Hannah had not raised her voice. She had not gestured wildly. She had not done anything except refuse to accept humiliation as her due. But that was enough, apparently. Refusing to be small was itself a crime in the eyes of men like Mercer. The security guard approached, his expression apologetic. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Hannah gathered her resume from the counter where Mercer had dropped it. The paper had picked up a coffee stain from someone's careless hand. 5 years of service, reduced to an unverified gap. 73 lives saved, converted into suspicion. The citation she'd received in a classified briefing, the one with the president's signature that she could never show anyone, never mention, never use to defend herself against men like Mercer, all of it reduced to nothing. She walked toward the exit. Carlos held the door open, uncomfortable in his role as enforcer. The mall air hit her, cooler and fresher than the retail environment, carrying the smell of rubber and floor wax and the faint metallic scent of the food court's fryer oil. Behind her, she heard Mercer already on his phone, already filing reports, already beginning the process of turning her rejection into a narrative where he was the victim of her bad attitude. She heard the other applicants shifting in their chairs, returning to their forms, grateful they weren't her. The automatic doors hissed open and she stepped into Lenox Square proper, where the afternoon light slanted through the skylights and hit the terrazzo floor in geometric patterns. She walked past the jewelry store and the high-end boutiques and the stores that sold things people didn't need but wanted anyway. Her resume was in her left hand. In her right pocket, her fingers found the phone that had exactly 3 numbers programmed into it, a number that connected to a Pentagon switchboard, a number that would be answered by someone who knew exactly what her clearance level was, and a number for her mother, whom she hadn't called in 18 months. She didn't cry. Not in the mall. Not while people were watching. She walked to the bathroom near the food court and locked herself in a stall and sat down on the closed toilet, and her hands shook, but her face remained dry. Just one tear escaped, brief and unwilling, and she wiped it away before it could fall. Her chest rose and fell in measured increments. 5 counts in. 7 counts out. The breathing technique they'd taught her in field medicine, the one that kept you calm when the patient was crashing and you were the only surgeon in 100 kilometers. The folded flag felt heavier in her pocket than it had this morning. Heavier than it had in the week after Captain Maria Reyes had been KIA. Heavier than it had when the Navy chaplain had given it to her with instructions never to mention it to anyone. She sat in the bathroom stall of Lenox Square Mall in Atlanta, in a city where nobody knew her name, where nobody knew what she'd done, where nobody knew that just a nurse applying for minimum wage retail work had once held the carotid artery of a bleeding Marine between her fingers and sutured it closed with battlefield medicine and improvisation and a composure that had been forged in fire. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that this would happen again. And again. And again. For as long as she remained invisible, unverified, untethered from the proof of what she actually was. For as long as the Pentagon kept her service record buried, kept her classified, kept her disappeared into civilian life with no way to prove that the 5-year gap was real and honorable and cost her everything. She left the bathroom. She walked past the food court, past the escalators, toward the mall exit. She had 12 minutes before she needed to take the MARTA bus back to her apartment, where the bills were stacked on the counter and the refrigerator was nearly empty, and a job she didn't get today meant dinner would be rice and a protein bar if she was careful. But in exactly 7 days, a man would collapse near the pretzel stand, and Hannah Clarke would not be a rejected retail applicant anymore. Hannah Clarke would be something else entirely. She just didn't know it yet. Hannah sat alone at a sticky table in the food court, the rejection letter folded precisely in her lap. 30 minutes had passed since Mercer had dismissed her with that practiced sneer, since Carlos had escorted her toward the exit with apologetic eyes and a hand on her elbow. The mall hummed around her, teenagers laughing by the orange Julius stand, families navigating shopping bags, the pretzel vendor's mechanical voice calling out orders. None of them were watching. None of them knew that the woman in the corner was holding her breathing steady through sheer muscle memory, the kind of steady that had kept her alive in a field hospital outside Tikrit where the walls bled desert dust and the sounds never stopped. She had left her apartment keys on Mercer's counter. Stupid. She needed them to get back inside tonight. So she sat here, watching the crowd flow past like a current around a stone, and made the decision to retrieve them. In and out. Mercer would be busy. She wouldn't see him. This was a math problem with a simple solution. The food court was crowded enough that she could move through it without drawing attention. That was the point of crowds, they made you invisible if you moved with purpose. She had learned that lesson in places where invisibility meant survival. She stood, tucking the rejection letter into her purse alongside the folded flag, when she heard it, the sound of a man's chest collapsing like a building coming down in slow motion. An elderly man in a navy dress uniform stood near the pretzel stand, his hand clutching at his ribs. His face had shifted from tan to a particular shade of blue that Hannah's body recognized before her mind caught up. Distended neck veins. Muffled sound when he tried to speak. The cyanosis of someone drowning in their own pericardial fluid. Cardiac tamponade. Her hands moved forward before the thought finished forming. The crowd scattered like startled birds. Phones appeared, a dozen of them, maybe more, angling for the perfect shot of tragedy. The pretzel vendor screamed something unintelligible into a radio. A child started crying. Someone called 911 from 3 different directions. Hannah dropped her purse and knelt beside the man, her voice dropping to the register that had cleared operating theaters in field conditions. I need space. Now. The crowd hesitated. Hannah didn't. Her fingers found his ribs with the precision of someone who had counted them in the dark, in the chaos, in the red haze of emergency medicine under fire. 4th intercostal space. 5th rib. The landmarks were the same whether you were 3,000 miles from home or in a shopping mall in Atlanta. Someone get me a knife. Clean knife. Now. A Sparrow employee appeared holding a steak knife like it was a holy relic. The rubber handle was warm. Hannah gestured to the mall bar cart being pushed past by a teenager in a polo shirt. Vodka. The highest proof you have. He stared at her. Move. The authority in her voice did what the request had not. He was back in 15 seconds with a bottle of 80-proof Grey Goose. Hannah poured it across the knife blade, across the entry point she'd already identified, across her own hands. The smell hit first, sharp, chemical, the kind of antiseptic that didn't exist in field hospitals but came close enough. Her hands moved like they were operated by someone else entirely, someone who had done this exact procedure 47 times under conditions infinitely worse than a shopping mall food court. She could feel Mercer watching. She didn't look at him. Mercer had radios to his ear, already speaking in the tone of someone filing complaints. Carlos was frozen by the entrance to the sporting goods store, his hand hovering over his radio like it might save him from having to act. Neither of them mattered. The man mattered. The blue color mattered. The rhythm that was no longer a rhythm mattered. Hannah's left hand found the ribs. Her right hand positioned the blade. The entry point was precise, between the 4th and 5th ribs, avoiding the vessels, targeting the pericardial sac with the kind of certainty that comes from having already done something dozens of times under fire. There was a moment of resistance, then the knife slid through tissue with a small sound like tearing silk. Blood released. Dark, venous blood that had been suffocating the heart. It spilled across her wrist, warm and immediate. The man gasped, a real breath, deep and desperate, and his color began shifting back toward human. His neck veins dropped. His eyes focused. Hannah kept her hand steady while the crowd made sounds like a wave breaking. Someone's iPhone was still recording. Hannah could see the red light reflecting off the spilled blood. The paramedics arrived with the kind of speed that suggested someone had called earlier and made them take the route seriously. 2 of them, both male, both moving with practiced efficiency until they saw what had happened. until they saw the knife still positioned precisely in Hannah's hand and the blood and the elderly man breathing like someone who had been pulled back from a very specific edge. "Who did the procedure?" The lead paramedic, a woman's voice, steady as stone, looked at Hannah. "Pericardiocentesis. Between the fourth and fifth ribs. Blood in the pericardial sac was causing tamponade. He should respond to fluid replacement and monitoring." The paramedic stared at her, then at the knife, then at Admiral Robert Chen, whose color was returning in real time. That was when Mercer appeared from the direction of his store, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice dripping with the kind of false concern that comes from someone who has already decided on a narrative. "Yes, I need to report an incident. A dangerous individual just assaulted a customer with a weapon. There was an unstable former applicant here earlier, same person, I'm certain of it. She attacked this man in front of dozens of witnesses. I'm filing an incident report with mall management and corporate immediately. We have massive liability exposure." Hannah's jaw tightened. She didn't move her hand. She didn't break eye contact with the paramedic who was now looking at her with the specific expression of someone trying to understand exactly what they were witnessing. The blood on her wrist felt warm and heavy. The knife in her hand felt exactly like what it was, evidence of someone stepping outside the boundaries of what a person in a job interview was supposed to be capable of. The crowd was still filming. Mercer was still on his phone, his voice climbing slightly as he described the assault to whoever was managing the mall's legal exposure. Carlos was pretending to organize something near the entrance to the store. Hannah could hear the helicopter blades before anyone else did. Not yet, that was still coming. Right now there was only the pretzel vendor asking if the man needed water, only the paramedics working with quiet efficiency, only the sound of Hannah's own breathing staying exactly level while everything else was about to fracture into 1,000 pieces moving at impossible speeds. The thing about secrets is that they have weight. They take up space. They make you move differently, breathe differently, hold yourself at a particular angle so no one accidentally discovers what you're really carrying. Hannah had been carrying her weight perfectly, until the moment she dropped it all on a sticky food court floor and picked up a knife and became exactly what she'd been before she became a woman applying for jobs at medical supply stores. Mercer was still talking. His words floated past like things that didn't matter. The paramedics were already moving Admiral Chen onto a stretcher with a kind of careful precision that suggested they understood they were witnessing something far more significant than they had the clearance to acknowledge. Hannah wiped the blood from her hands using a napkin from the Sparrow stand, each motion exact, each breath controlled. The rejection letter was still in her purse. The folded flag was still in her purse. Both of them suddenly felt very close to surfaces they should never have touched. The paramedics wheeled Admiral Chen toward the ambulance, one of them calling back to Hannah with gratitude in his voice. "What's your name for the report?" Before she could answer, Mercer stepped between them, his tablet already glowing with typed notes. "She's not authorized to be on mall property. I'll handle all official statements." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd practiced sounding important in front of mirrors. Carlos stood nearby, and resting on his radio like it was a loaded weapon, making Hannah's presence feel less like rescue and more like crime scene. The paramedic frowned. But she just performed emergency pericardiocentesis. She clearly has medical training. Mercer didn't look up from his screen. "I have witness statements. 3 of them. Carefully cultivated in the 20 minutes since the Admiral had collapsed. He'd moved through the food court crowd like a sculptor, shaping testimony. You saw an agitated woman approach an elderly man with a blade, correct? That's how he'd phrased it to each person. Not save. Not emergency. Agitated. Woman. Blade. The language did the work his case couldn't. One woman had hesitated. Mercer had leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "I understand you want to help her. The problem is, we can't help people who don't follow protocol. And what she did, using a weapon on a customer, that's precisely the kind of liability our insurance company needs documented." The woman had nodded then. "Insurance. Liability. Words that made people complicit without them realizing it. Hannah watched him work. She'd seen officers brief intelligence analysts with less precision. He pulled out his phone and gestured to Marcus, the young IT technician with the prosthetic hand, a veteran, Hannah had noted, someone who understood military hierarchy. I need the security footage transferred to my personal drive. We need to preserve the evidence chain. It wasn't a request. It was phrased like one, but the tone underneath was absolute. Marcus looked uncomfortable. His prosthetic fingers twitched. The footage is stored on the mall server. Should what, Marcus? Let this incident disappear? I'm documenting everything. For your protection. For the mall's protection. The prosthetic hand lowered. Marcus nodded. He'd take the footage off the server later, copy it to Mercer's personal drive, and the chain of custody would blur into something defensible. Hannah tried again as the Admiral's stretcher rolled closer to the ambulance doors. He needs immediate cardiothoracic surgery. The pericardial tamponade, if they don't get him into an OR within the hour, the fluid reaccumulation could compress the heart again. Mercer turned to face her fully. His eyes were the color of old concrete. You need to leave now or I'm having you arrested for trespassing and assault with a deadly weapon. One of the paramedics, the one with the sergeant's bearing, someone who'd taken charge before, looked genuinely confused. But she saved his life. The Admiral's asking for her name. Mercer held up his tablet. The screen showed his witness statements, each one a small knife. I have 3 accounts stating she attacked him unprovoked. One witness says she was shouting incoherently. The knife is evidence. The paramedic's face went neutral. That neutral was the moment. That was when evidence became more real than truth. That was when a lie, if documented well enough, became institutional fact. Hannah's hands trembled. The first time. The first public crack in the composure that had held through 18-hour surgeries in field hospitals, that had stood firm while IEDs screamed overhead, that had never faltered when Captain Maria Reyes had volunteered to take her place in the rotation. Not even then. But now, watching Mercer construct a narrative where her hands became dangerous, where her training became assault, where her presence at a specific place at a specific moment, 2:53 p.m. on a Tuesday in a Lenox Square food court, became the problem. Instead of the solution, her hands betrayed her. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was every rule she'd been trained to follow, every protocol she'd learned, every time she'd accepted injustice because that's what soldiers did, suddenly becoming visible. She closed her hands into fists and looked away. The Admiral looked back at her as they loaded him. His lips were better now, color returning. The crisis managed. The man would live because she'd moved through the crowd like muscle memory was a language and her hands could speak it fluently. And now that man was being wheeled away from her, and she was being introduced to him as a criminal, and there was nothing she could do about it without confirming every lie Mercer had constructed. That evening, Hannah sat in her apartment in the Mechanicsville district, a one-bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and a view of the I-75 overpass, and folded her professional blouse with military precision. The one she'd worn to the interview. The navy blue one from the Gap that had cost $47 and represented everything she'd thought would restart her civilian life. She folded it along the seams, then folded again, reducing it until it was a perfect rectangle. Like a flag ceremony. Like a uniform being retired. The folded flag was still in her purse. She'd carried it for 3 years. A small piece of silk the color of twilight, 5 inches by 8 inches, with the creases pressed so hard they'd become permanent. Captain Maria Reyes. Tactical Combat Casualty Care Certified. Field surgeon with hands that moved like they were reading music only she could hear. Reyes had been 28 years old when she'd raised her hand during the volunteer briefing and asked to take Hannah's slot on the 4th rotation. I'm single. No dependents. You've got the kid. Hannah had 2 cats and a mortgage on an apartment. Reyes had had a mother in Phoenix and a dream of working in pediatric trauma. She'd had 4 days of duty left when the IED detonated outside Tikrit General Hospital. The flag in Hannah's purse was what came back instead of the woman. Hannah removed it now, very carefully, the way someone handles things that might break if they're touched wrong. The silk was cool against her palms. She thought about Operation Silent Shepherd, the classified med support initiative that the Pentagon had buried so completely that her entire 5-year service record had been redacted. Not sealed. Redacted. It was as if those years had been removed from the timeline of her life, cut out with a scalpel, leaving her with a wound that couldn't be explained to anyone who saw it. The doctors asked where she'd been. The HR people asked about the gap. And she couldn't say. Couldn't say Tikrit. Couldn't say field hospital. Couldn't say that she'd trained soldiers to treat hemorrhagic shock with tourniquets and direct pressure. Couldn't say that she'd performed 47 consecutive trauma surgeries. Couldn't say any of it, because the Pentagon had classified the program's existence and designated her under a code name she wasn't supposed to remember, Nightingale. She'd survived that erasure. The quiet kind. The institutional kind. The kind that happens when the government itself decides you were never there. And now Mercer was erasing her again. A different knife, but the same principle. Not through classification, but through documentation. Through carefully shaped witness statements. Through a video transferred to a personal drive, where it could be edited, recontextualized, presented to authorities in whatever narrative served Mercer best. He was building a file. She could see it forming. By tomorrow, there would be a formal complaint to mall management. By the end of the week, there would be a police report. By next week, there might be charges. A man like Mercer didn't stop. He compounded. He documented. He let the system do the violence while he stood at a distance looking concerned. Hannah sat in darkness, the apartment's lights off, only the glow of the overpass lamps filtering through the window, and held the flag. Rain had started outside. It hammered the windows like applause or judgment, depending on how you listened. She thought about Captain Maria Reyes, who'd volunteered to take her place, who'd died 4 days later, who'd been given a flag ceremony and a notification officer and 3-volley salute that had been classified so completely that Hannah couldn't even attend. They'd said it was a routine training exercise casualty. Nothing more. Nothing to see. No body. No funeral. No name mentioned. Just a flag folded by the Army's most practiced hands and delivered to Reyes's mother in Phoenix with instructions not to speak about it. Hannah had received a copy of that flag, a duplicate, officially, with a letter explaining that she should keep it safe and tell no one why. Those were the words. Tell no one why. She'd carried it for 3 years. Through every job interview. Through every apartment. Through every moment when someone asked about her employment history and she had to smile and change the subject. The Pentagon had erased her once. Made her invisible to the official record. Removed her from the timeline of herself. And she'd accepted it because that's what soldiers did. That's what you did when the government politely suggested that your existence was classified. That's what you did when they said your service was too sensitive to acknowledge. You disappeared. You went quiet. You folded the flag of someone else's sacrifice and carried it in your purse like a secret that could break you if you let it out. But Mercer's erasure was different. It was active. It was malicious. It was a man with a clipboard deciding that her value was negative, her presence was criminal, her gift for saving lives was actually a gift for causing trouble. The rain kept falling. Hannah kept sitting in the dark with a folded flag that represented 3 years of institutional silence and the weight of a woman's life that had been traded for her continued breathing. She was 28 when Reyes died. Hannah had been 25. That was 3 years ago. Reyes would have been 31 now. Instead, she was a story that couldn't be told. A file marked classified. A name that didn't exist in any official capacity. And Hannah was here, folding her interview blouse in an apartment with water stains on the ceiling, waiting for the next move from a man who was building a case against her for being competent at the only thing she'd ever been trained to do. Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, Hannah sat alone with the weight of 2 erasures, one official, one personal, and understood that she was running out of places to hide. 1 week later, the fluorescent lights of Corner Market hummed their flat white song as Hannah pushed a cart down aisle 3, selecting groceries with the mechanical precision of someone whose hands moved while her mind remained elsewhere. Milk. Bread. Coffee she couldn't afford but bought anyway. The checkout line stretched 3 people deep when the man behind her went completely still. She felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of attention that military personnel recognized instantly. The kind of stare that carried weight. Hannah didn't turn. She'd spent 7 years learning not to turn. You. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Arabic accent, rough with emotion. You are, no. It cannot be. Hannah's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes forward, watching the elderly cashier ring up her items with agonizing slowness. The man stepped closer. His hands trembled. The Angel of Tikrit. Supernala. I thought you were dead. They told us the hospital was destroyed. That everyone, his voice broke like old glass. My cousin. You saved him. You were covered in blood and screaming orders and you just kept working. Hannah's cart went rigid beneath her grip. Every muscle locked. Her breathing remained controlled, measured, steady, the breathing of someone who'd held it together through things that would shatter ordinary people, but her mind screamed a single word, run. Please don't speak, she whispered. You have to stop speaking. No. The man's eyes gleamed wet. No, my cousin, he became a Marine. He became strong because you gave him back his life. He needs to know. He needs to. His phone appeared in his shaking hands, fingers fumbling across the screen. I'm calling him. I'm calling Hassan right now. Hannah saw the numbers being dialed. She saw the phone rising to his ear. She saw her 7 years of enforced invisibility collapsing like a building that had only ever been made of wind and silence. She abandoned the cart. She moved past him without running because running would draw attention, but every muscle fiber wanted to tear through the store like something hunted. The September rain hit her like a wall when she burst through the doors. She walked for 4 hours. Didn't know where. The city's arteries twisted around her, streets she'd memorized and streets she'd never seen, all equally indifferent to the fact that Captain Hannah Clarke was currently unraveling in real time. Her phone stayed dark. She'd learned long ago not to keep numbers of people she couldn't call. By 11 p.m., she sat on the floor of her apartment in the dark, staring at nothing. The folded flag sat on her dresser, positioned exactly where she'd placed it that final night a week ago when the trespassing notice arrived. Captain Maria Reyes. Dead on her 4th day, in a field hospital that officially didn't exist, performing surgeries that officially never happened, saving lives that the Pentagon had officially erased from every database. Hannah had been ordered to disappear. Not to flee. Not to hide. To cease. The Pentagon's language had been precise: you will assume civilian identity. You will not speak of Operation Silent Shepherd. You will not contact former unit members. You will not attempt to verify your military service. Any violation of this directive will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act. They'd given her a discharge papers listing her as administrative personnel, medical support. No rank. No combat designation. No medals. The woman who'd performed 47 consecutive trauma surgeries under direct enemy fire, who'd received 2 Silver Stars and a Navy Cross, was officially nothing. A ghost that had never served. A legend that had never existed. Codename Nightingale. The Pentagon's perfect erasure. She was still sitting in the dark when the sound came. At first, it was distant, a rhythmic percussion that made her spine straighten without permission. Helicopter rotors. The sound cut through her apartment like someone dragging a knife through silk. Hannah moved to the window automatically, muscle memory older than her civilian life taking over. The Navy Black Hawk descended toward the parking lot of her apartment complex like something materializing from a nightmare. Its rotors threw rain sideways in sheets. The landing light swept across the weathered asphalt and then held steady as the aircraft touched down with the precision of a surgeon placing a needle. Boots! She heard them first, the rhythm that was unmistakable after 12 years of hearing it every single day. 1, 2, 3, 4. Measured steps on pavement. Multiple sets. A formation. Hannah's breath came shallow. Her hands found the door frame for support. When she opened the door, Admiral Robert Chen stood in her hallway in full dress uniform, decoration medals catching the apartment complex's lights like small promises. Behind him stood a Navy Lieutenant Commander carrying a leather folder embossed with gold insignia. Behind them both, filling the stairs and the parking lot visible through the window, stood 150 active duty sailors in crisp formations, rain streaming down their faces while they held their positions with the kind of discipline that transcended weather and circumstance. "Captain Clarke," the Admiral said. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd commanded fleets. "I believe we have some paperwork for you." The Lieutenant Commander stepped forward. Hannah noticed his hands were steady as he opened the folder, but there was something in his eyes, recognition. Respect. The kind that came from understanding exactly what he was standing in the presence of. He began to read, his voice clear and formal. "For extraordinary valor during Operation Silent Shepherd." Hannah's knees went soft. The rank. He'd used her rank. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 7 years. The Lieutenant Commander continued, "Where you performed 47 consecutive trauma surgeries under direct enemy fire and saved an entire Marine reconnaissance unit, including the colonel who would later oversee all Middle East intelligence operations." Doors opened along the apartment corridor. Her neighbors emerged, phones already filming. A news van pulled up to the complex's entrance, its satellite uplink antenna rising toward the rain-soaked sky. She heard her landlord's voice from somewhere behind the crowd. "Wait, you're evicting her." The Lieutenant Commander didn't pause. "Your actions were so classified that the Pentagon erased your complete service record and ordered you into civilian disappearance under the Witness Security Protocol for military personnel. You were designated under codename Nightingale." The words hung in the rain like something that couldn't possibly be real. He continued, "You held the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Purple Heart, all held in a Pentagon vault since your operational termination awaiting declassification." That's when Dr. Gerald Mercer pushed through the gathering crowd. He moved fast, his face already flushed, Carlos the security guard trailing behind him and looking deeply uncomfortable. "This is stolen valor," Mercer announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have documentation that this woman is unstable and dangerous. She assaulted Admiral Chen with a weapon at Lenox Square, I reported it. This is fraud." The Admiral turned his head slowly. The movement was deliberate. Cold. His eyes met Mercer's with the kind of focus that made the doctor step backward despite himself. "You're wrong," Admiral Chen said. "It wasn't a request. It was a command. She saved my life twice. Once 7 years ago in a field hospital in Tikrit when I was a young officer bleeding out from a cardiac wound. And once last week when she performed emergency pericardiocentesis with a borrowed knife while you filed false reports instead of calling for medical assistance." Mercer's jaw worked silently. Behind him, a young man in IT department uniform stepped forward carrying a hard drive. "Marcus." Hannah recognized him from the mall, one of the faces in the crowd. "Sir," Marcus said, addressing the Admiral, "Dr. Mercer attempted to delete security footage of Captain Clarke saving your life. I recovered all of it. I also found his communications regarding an arrangement with one of the jewelry vendors. That's why he refused to help during the emergency. The vendor's son was the actual shoplifter, and the vendor compensates Dr. Mercer monthly." 2 Atlanta police officers emerged from the crowd with the kind of certainty that came from having done this before. Admiral Chen extended his hand to Hannah, not to shake, but the gesture of one officer honoring another. "Welcome home, Captain. The Navy has some explaining to do." The rain fell harder, and behind the Admiral, 150 sailors held their formation in perfect stillness, water streaming down their faces, and Hannah understood in that moment that invisibility had an end date, and hers had just expired. The rain fell harder, and behind the Admiral, 150 sailors held their formation in perfect stillness, water streaming down their faces. Hannah understood in that moment that invisibility had an end date, and hers had just expired. Then Marcus stepped forward. The young IT technician moved through the crowd with a hard drive in his trembling hands. 23 years old, maybe 24, with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd served, a slight limp favoring his left leg, the kind of scar that came from IED shrapnel, not a kitchen accident. He approached Admiral Chen with the deference of enlisted addressing flag officer, but his eyes were fixed on Mercer. "Sir, I have evidence," Marcus said. His voice was steady. "Trained. Everything you need." Mercer's face shifted. The color drained like someone had opened a valve. He moved toward Marcus with his hand extended, a gesture that might have been diplomatic if it hadn't looked like a predator lunging at wounded prey. "That's classified property of the mall," Mercer said. "You have no authority to." "Atlanta Police Department has authority," said a voice from the gathering crowd. An officer stepped forward, rain darkening his uniform. Two more behind him. "And they're here about evidence destruction, fraud, and witness tampering." "We'll take that drive." Marcus handed it over and stepped back beside Hannah. He didn't look at her directly, but his jaw clenched once, hard, before he schooled his face back to neutral. Later, Hannah would understand that Marcus had spent the last week documenting everything Mercer had done, not for her, but because the code mattered. Because in the military, you protect your own. And Hannah was military. The officer connected the hard drive to a laptop, rain hammering the hood as he worked. The crowd pressed closer. Someone's phone was recording. Then another. Then 6 more. The video of Hannah performing the pericardiocentesis had gone viral 3 days ago, for million views, climbing, and now every second of this parking lot was being streamed live. The footage appeared on the screen. Timestamp, 2:34 p.m., the afternoon of Hannah's rejection. Mercer in the security office, his voice recorded crystal clear through the system microphone, "Get that footage off the server. I want it wiped. Clean. That incident never happened. I'm filing an incident report claiming she assaulted a customer. We have liability exposure. If anyone asks, you didn't see anything." The security guard on the recording, a man named Derek, looked at Mercer with something between fear and disgust. "Sir, that's destruction of evidence. It's preservation of the mall's reputation. Do it now." Derek didn't destroy the footage. He'd copied it instead and left it in a secure cloud folder with a timestamp. Marcus had found the backup. And he'd found something else. "Emails," Marcus said, pointing at the laptop. His finger traced across 18 months of digital correspondence. Between Dr. Mercer and James Silverstein, owner of the Diamond Meridian jewelry vendor in the mall. Mercer was protecting them from any loss prevention audits. The officer leaned closer. Numbers appeared on screen. $40,000 in kickbacks. 40,000. Not subtle transfers, either, consulting fees, promotional expenses, actual invoices signed by both men. "You were coaching witnesses," the officer continued, reading from the screen now. His voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting evidence in a courtroom. "Email to Derek, 6 hours after the incident, tell anyone who asks that the woman looked unstable. Frantic. Maybe mention she was muttering to herself. We need to establish a pattern of erratic behavior." Mercer tried to speak. "Those are private communications. That's harassment. Those emails are protected under?" "They're part of a federal obstruction investigation," Admiral Chen said. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't need volume. He had the weight of the United States Navy behind every syllable. Captain Clarke's service record was classified at the highest level under Operation Silent Shepherd. Destroying evidence related to her identity, her medical actions, and her presence in this facility constitutes a federal crime. Mercer's breathing had changed. Shallow. Rapid. The breathing of a man watching everything he'd built ignite. The mall's regional director arrived within minutes, soaking wet, eyes wide as she took in the scene. 150 Navy personnel in formation. Police cars with lights rotating. A viral video playing on every phone in the crowd. She looked at Mercer the way someone looks at her expired product. "You're terminated," she said. "Effective immediately. Criminal charges are pending through the district attorney's office. You'll receive notification of severance, or lack thereof, from our legal team." Mercer reached for his phone. His hands were shaking. Actually shaking now, the kind of tremor that comes from adrenaline collapse. He dialed his attorney's number. The call went to voicemail. The witnesses who'd given statements, teenagers hired for holiday work, began recanting immediately. A girl named Sophie, no more than 17, started crying as a news camera pointed in her direction. "He said we'd lose our jobs if we didn't say she looked crazy," Sophie said. "He made us practice what to say. He said, if anyone asks, you tell them she was muttering. You say she looked unstable. He coached all of us. We didn't even see what really happened. We were scared." The other witnesses nodded in unison. Their stories unraveled like someone pulling a thread on a sweater. Everything Mercer had constructed, every barrier he'd built around himself with documentation and false narratives, became evidence against him instead. A federal subpoena was served on Mercer by the lieutenant commander at 3:48 p.m. Destruction of evidence in a matter involving a flag officer. Federal crime. His face when he read those words looked like someone had pressed a blade between his ribs. Atlanta Police Department formally arrested him at 3:52 p.m. The officers were professional, mechanical in their efficiency. They didn't look at him with anger or disgust. They looked at him with nothing. The nothing was worse. As they walked him toward the patrol car, they had to pass Hannah. She stood at attention, dress uniform soaked but perfect, her bearing like a monument. The rain continued to fall. One tear escaped down her cheek, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without moving a muscle, standing with the posture of someone who'd been shaped by discipline and survival. She said exactly one sentence. "You tried to bury my heroism because you couldn't recognize it through your own cowardice." Her voice, when she finally spoke, sounded like a tank idling in a garage. Low. Mechanical. Absolutely certain. Mercer flinched as if struck. He tried to respond, but the officers were already moving him toward the car. His wife had called his cell 6 times. His lawyer's voicemail was full. The kickback scheme with the jewelry vendor meant additional charges. Tax fraud. Conspiracy. Wire fraud. As the police car door closed, Admiral Chen raised his hand. 150 sailors, Marines, Navy personnel, support staff, came to attention and saluted in perfect unison. Their hands rose like a single organism. Like a wave. Like everything that Mercer wasn't and would never be. Hannah's hand rested against her chest. Her eyes followed the police car until it disappeared into the Atlanta traffic, then she turned back to face the formation of 150 personnel who had come because one translator had remembered the Angel of Tikrit. Because one admiral had refused to let her disappear twice. Because integrity, in the end, was the only currency that mattered. The rain hammered down. The crowd was still recording. The moment would be watched by 3 million people before midnight. And Hannah Clarke stood among her people, finally named, finally visible, finally home. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.